He smiled automatically, expecting a quick check-in or a reminder about dinner. But when he answered, he heard only strained breathing on the other end. Before this story truly begins, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our top-notch, deeply moving tales. These are stories that stay with you long after the final word is spoken. Ethan Walker never believed his life would amount to something worth telling. He was an ordinary man by most American standards, mid-30s, steady job in construction management, small rented house on the quiet edge of Cedar Ridge, Ohio. He paid his bills on time, waved at his neighbors, and lived by one simple rule taught to him by his late father: don't go looking for trouble, and trouble usually won't find you. For years, that rule seemed to work. Every morning before sunrise, Ethan brewed the same dark coffee, black and bitter, and stood at the kitchen window watching the neighborhood slowly wake. The sound of sprinklers ticking on, a dog barking 2 houses down, the distant hum of traffic heading toward downtown. These moments grounded him. They reminded him that life, even when it felt heavy, still moved forward. He loved his wife Grace in a quiet but unshakable way. Their love wasn't loud or dramatic. It was built from shared silences, from inside jokes whispered late at night, from hands instinctively reaching for each other in crowded rooms. Grace worked as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center, spending her days helping strangers learn to walk again, to lift their arms again, to believe in their own bodies again. Ethan admired her more than he ever told her. On weekends, they visited Ethan's mother, Ruth, who lived alone since his father's passing. She was the kind of woman who never let grief harden her heart. Her house always smelled like cinnamon and old books, and she insisted on packing leftovers no matter how short the visit. To Ethan, that house was still home in every way that mattered. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good, and Ethan was content with that. The first crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon in late October. Ethan was wrapping up a site inspection when his phone buzzed. Grace's name lit up the screen. He smiled automatically, expecting a quick check-in or a reminder about dinner. But when he answered, he heard only strained breathing on the other end. "Ethan?" he said, his voice tightening. There was a pause, and then her voice came through, thin, shaken. "Ethan, I need you to come to the hospital, not the one I work at, Mercy General, please." Something in her tone sliced through him. He didn't ask questions. He told his supervisor he had an emergency and drove faster than he ever had, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. At Mercy General, the fluorescent lights felt harsh, unforgiving. Grace sat in a chair near the emergency wing, her face pale, eyes red and distant. When she saw Ethan, she stood and collapsed into his arms, shaking. It took several minutes before she could speak. "There was an accident," she said finally, "on my way home." Ethan listened as doctors explained the damage, broken bones, internal injuries, complications that would take months, maybe years to heal. Grace would walk again, they said, but nothing would ever be the same. Her career, the one she loved, was suddenly uncertain. Ethan stayed calm on the outside. He asked questions. He signed forms. He held Grace's hand and told her everything would be okay, even though fear churned violently in his chest. What he didn't know, what no one told him yet, was that the accident hadn't been an accident at all. Weeks passed, heavy and slow. Medical bills piled up on the kitchen counter. Grace's laughter faded, replaced by long silences and restless nights filled with pain and frustration. Ethan worked longer hours, took side jobs, did whatever he could to keep them afloat. He told himself this was what marriage meant, carrying the weight together. Then one evening, while sorting through insurance paperwork, Ethan noticed something that didn't sit right. A witness report mentioned a black SUV that had sped away before police arrived. Another document referenced a security camera near the intersection that had mysteriously malfunctioned. Ethan's stomach tightened. He began asking questions, quiet ones, the kind that didn't attract attention. A retired cop who lived down the street mentioned casually that hit-and-run cases involving that area often disappeared. A nurse at the hospital whispered that Grace's injuries didn't match the story she'd been told. Bit by bit, a terrible truth emerged. Someone had wanted Grace out of the way, and the reason traced back to a powerful development firm tied to the rehabilitation center where Grace worked, a firm that didn't like whistleblowers and didn't tolerate resistance. Ethan felt something shift inside him then. Not rage, not yet. Something colder, something deliberate. Revenge still wasn't his plan. All he wanted was the truth. But fate, as he would soon learn, had its own intentions.
As days turned into months, the weight of what had happened began to press down on every corner of Ethan and Grace's life. Pain was no longer something that visited and left. It moved in and made itself at home. Grace's body healed in fragments, but her spirit lagged behind, bruised in places no scan could show. She woke in the night gasping, her hands clawing at the sheets, her eyes wide with terror she couldn't explain. Ethan learned to sleep lightly, always half awake, always listening. The woman who once filled rooms with warmth now flinched at sudden noises. She stared at her reflection longer than necessary, as if searching for the person she used to be. The rehabilitation center called twice during the first month, then stopped altogether. When Ethan asked about it, Grace turned her face away and said nothing. That silence hurt more than her screams. Ethan tried to be strong, but strength has limits. He watched the bills pile higher. He watched friends slowly disappear, their concern fading when recovery stretched longer than expected. Even his mother's voice over the phone carried worry she tried to hide. And through it all, Ethan felt watched, an unsettling awareness that grew sharper each time a strange car idled too long near their street, or an unfamiliar number hung up when he answered the phone. One evening, while Grace slept, Ethan finally opened her laptop. He hadn't meant to invade her privacy. He was only looking for an old insurance email, but what he found instead stopped his breath. There were messages, dozens of them, saved, archived, hidden beneath folders with harmless names. Emails between Grace and a journalist based in Chicago, attachments labeled with dates and coded titles. Internal reports from the rehabilitation center detailing unsafe practices, falsified patient outcomes, and quiet payouts to keep families silent. At the center of it all was a name that appeared again and again: Calderon Development Group. Ethan felt sick. Grace hadn't just been a therapist, she had been a problem. He sat there in the dark, the glow of the screen burning his eyes, realizing how little he had truly known about the war his wife had been fighting alone. The final email was unfinished, saved as a draft. It read, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident." Ethan closed the laptop with shaking hands. The next morning he confronted her gently, not with anger, but with fear. Grace listened in silence as he spoke, her face slowly collapsing under the weight of the truth she could no longer carry alone. When she finally broke, she sobbed like someone mourning her own life. "They threatened patience," she whispered. "They buried mistakes. People trusted us, Ethan. I couldn't look away." Ethan pulled her into his chest, his heart pounding with a new understanding. Love suddenly felt like a liability, a weakness someone else had exploited. Still, revenge wasn't his plan. He went to the police. What followed was a lesson in quiet corruption. Files were missing, jurisdiction was unclear, promises were made and never returned. A detective advised him, kindly, almost apologetically, to let it go. People with money don't lose, they just delay. Then the pressure escalated. Ethan lost a major contract at work without explanation. Grace's disability claim stalled. Someone vandalized their car. Another anonymous call came late one night, a voice distorted and calm, telling Ethan to stop digging if he wanted to keep what little he had left. That was the night something finally cracked.
Ethan stood in the kitchen long after Grace went to bed, staring at the knife block on the counter, not with violent intent, but with the dawning realization that morality was a luxury afforded only to the protected. He thought about his father's rule, about avoiding trouble, about all the times he had chosen peace. Peace had not chosen him. The betrayal ran deeper than he imagined. It wasn't just corporations and money. It was systems, people he'd trusted, hands that shook his and smiles that lied. Ethan began to understand that justice, in its purest form, was often abandoned long before it reached people like him. And for the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to feel anger. Not wild, not reckless, focused. Revenge still wasn't his goal, but survival was. And fate, relentless and patient, was quietly guiding his hand. Ethan didn't wake up the next morning as a different man. Change, he learned, rarely announced itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as necessity. He started small, harmless, almost invisible steps. He fixed things around the house himself instead of calling repairmen, watched videos late at night with headphones on, learning skills he never thought he'd need, how to bypass a faulty lock, how surveillance cameras stored data, how to disappear in plain sight in a city full of faces that didn't care. It wasn't obsession, he told himself. It was preparation. Any man protecting his family would do the same. He reconnected with people he hadn't spoken to in years. A former co-worker from a construction site in Pennsylvania who now ran private security contracts overseas. An old high school acquaintance who had fallen off the radar after joining the military and resurfaced years later with eyes that had seen too much. Their conversations were casual on the surface, but loaded beneath. Ethan learned which questions to ask and which not to. At home, he became gentler with Grace, more patient than ever. He cooked, cleaned, helped her through physical therapy exercises, even when she wanted to quit. Some nights she cried into his shoulder, apologizing for ruining their lives. Each time, something inside Ethan hardened, not against her, but against the world that had done this to them. He began keeping a notebook, not a journal, records, dates, names, license plates, patterns. He wrote in careful block letters, the kind that couldn't be mistaken later. Every strange car, every dropped call, every delay from insurance. It felt methodical, grounding, like building a structure from chaos. One afternoon, while sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store, Ethan noticed the same black SUV idling across from him. The windows were tinted, the engine running. When he pulled out, it followed for 3 blocks before turning away. His heart pounded, but his hand stayed steady on the wheel. Fear was no longer paralyzing. That realization unsettled him more than the SUV ever could. Ethan began to understand the rules of the game being played around him. Power didn't shout, it whispered. It didn't threaten directly, it applied pressure until people folded themselves. Calderon Development Group didn't need to finish him off, they just needed to make life unbearable enough that he would surrender. But surrender was a luxury he could no longer afford. Late one night, unable to sleep, Ethan drove to an old storage unit he'd kept since before his marriage. Inside were remnants of a life he'd nearly forgotten. Tools, documents, and a box belonging to his father. Ethan sat on the concrete floor and opened it for the first time in years. Inside were letters, court papers, and a truth his father had buried to protect his family.
His father hadn't died quietly of illness, as Ethan had been told. He had been crushed under corporate negligence during a construction cover-up decades earlier, one tied, disturbingly, to the same network of developers now threatening Ethan's life. The pattern was no longer coincidence. Ethan felt the final thread of innocence snap. This wasn't just about Grace, or him. It was inheritance. He left the storage unit at dawn with a clarity that scared him. Revenge still wasn't what drove him, not yet. What drove him was resolve, the kind forged when a man realizes the story he was given about his life was a lie. He understood now, survival required intention, preparation, willingness to stand alone if necessary. And somewhere deep within that understanding, fate tightened its grip. Ethan Walker was no longer waiting for justice. He was building the capacity to endure whatever came next. After 2 days, something unimaginable happened. Their house was broken into. Nothing was taken. Ethan noticed it first in the smallest detail. The back door wasn't fully latched. It stood open just enough to let the cold air creep inside, whispering across the kitchen floor. Grace was still asleep, curled inward as if protecting something fragile inside her. Ethan moved slowly, every sense sharpening, his pulse loud in his ears. Drawers were open, cabinets disturbed. The contents of his notebook, his records, his careful handwriting were gone. They hadn't stolen valuables. They hadn't touched the television, the laptop, or the envelope of cash hidden behind the water heater. Whoever had come knew exactly what they wanted, and worse, they wanted him to know they'd been there. Grace noticed the change in him before he said a word. She always had. "They were here," Ethan said quietly, sitting beside her on the bed, "while we slept." Her face drained of color. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The house felt smaller, compromised. Safe places had a way of dying all at once. That afternoon, Ruth called. Ethan almost let it go to voicemail. He was exhausted, stretched thin, his mind racing through contingencies. But something, instinct maybe, made him answer. "Mom?" he said. Her voice trembled. "Ethan, there's been someone asking questions. A man came by yesterday, said he was from a utility company, but he didn't have a badge. He knew your name. He knew Grace's." Cold settled in Ethan's chest. "What did he ask you?" Ethan said, forcing calm into his voice. "About your father," Ruth replied. "About old work sites, lawsuits, things I thought were long buried." Ethan closed his eyes. "I told him nothing," she added quickly. "But Ethan, I'm scared." He promised to come by the next day. He promised everything would be fine. Promises were becoming lies he told out of habit. That night, Ethan didn't sleep at all. He sat in the living room, lights off, listening to the house breathe. Every creak sounded like intent. Every passing headlight felt deliberate. He understood now that fear wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. It was meant to exhaust him. But exhaustion had already come and gone. 2 days later, Ruth was found unconscious in her home. A fall, they said. A stroke, maybe. The paramedics spoke gently, professionally, the way people do when they've already decided the story. Ethan stood in the hospital hallway again. The same sterile smell, the same cold lights, history looping cruelly back on itself. She survived, but she didn't wake up the same. Ruth's speech was slurred. Her memory came and went in fragments. Sometimes she recognized Ethan instantly. Other times she looked through him as if he were a stranger wearing her son's face. The doctors called it trauma, stress-induced, unpredictable. Ethan called it a message. Grace took the news silently. She reached for Ethan's hand and held it with a strength that surprised them both. In her eyes, he saw something change. Not fear, but resolve. She had lived long enough with guilt, long enough believing she was the cause of the suffering. Now she understood what Ethan had already accepted. This was bigger than either of them. "They won't stop," Grace said softly that night, "unless we disappear, or unless they're forced to."
Ethan nodded. That was the moment the last restraint fell away. Not in rage, not in grief, in clarity. He realized then that the people destroying his life were not monsters. They were worse. They were careful. They believed themselves untouchable, and they relied on the assumption that men like Ethan Walker would always choose endurance over resistance. They were wrong.
Ethan began moving differently after that. He sold the house quietly, under market value, through a proxy, moved Grace and Ruth into a small apartment under a different name. He stopped reacting to threats and started anticipating them. The man who once waved at neighbors now studied reflections in windows, exits in crowded spaces, routines that could be broken. Grace watched him change, and for the first time since the accident, she didn't try to stop it. Instead, she helped. She remembered things, names, procedures, meetings she'd once dismissed as routine. Together, they reconstructed the truth Calder and Development Group had spent years burying. Patterns of silence, patterns of payoff, patterns of people who vanished quietly, from careers, from lawsuits, from records. Ethan no longer asked if he was crossing a line. He asked how far the line had already been moved. One evening, while reviewing documents late into the night, Ethan received an email from an unknown address. No subject line, no greeting, just 4 words: "You're closer than you think." Attached was a single file, footage from a security camera thought to be malfunctioning. Grainy, incomplete, but unmistakable. A black SUV, Grace's car, impact, and a face in the driver's seat that Ethan recognized immediately. Someone he'd trusted, someone who had shaken his hand. Ethan closed the laptop slowly. The story he had lived by, the quiet man, the good husband, the obedient citizen, collapsed in on itself. What remained was something leaner, sharper. A man who understood that justice was not a gift, it was a confrontation. And whether he wanted it or not, Ethan Walker had been dragged into a war that would not end until someone finally paid the price. Ethan didn't react the way most people imagine a man would when the final truth reveals itself. There was no outburst, no shattered glass, no scream torn from the chest. There was only silence. He stared at the frozen image on the screen, the familiar face behind the wheel, the angle of the jaw, the posture he'd seen 100 times in boardrooms and job sites. A man who spoke about integrity, a man who prayed before meetings, a man who had once clapped Ethan on the shoulder and said, "Family always comes first." Ethan shut the laptop. Grace watched him from across the room. She didn't ask questions. She saw it in his eyes, the way something ancient and irrevocable had settled there. Not hatred, acceptance. "That's him," she said quietly. "Yes. What are you going to do?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Exactly what fate has been preparing me for." From that moment on, the story stopped being about exposure. It became about consequence.
Ethan understood something most men never do until it's too late. Truth alone doesn't dismantle power. Power only collapses when it becomes expensive to maintain. Calderon Development Group had survived lawsuits, journalists, and whistleblowers because the cost of silencing them had always been lower than the cost of accountability. So Ethan changed the math. He didn't leak everything at once. That would have been too clean, too merciful. Instead, he released information the way pressure releases steam: slow, controlled, devastating. Anonymous tips sent to regulators in different states, financial discrepancies mailed to investors with just enough detail to spark panic, construction violations reported at moments that delayed projects by weeks, then months. Every delay bled money. Every inquiry fractured trust. Calderon's inner circle began to turn on itself. Executives hired private investigators to watch one another. Meetings grew tense. Smiles became weapons. And still, Ethan stayed invisible. until fate demanded visibility. The man in the SUV, the same man who had nearly killed Grace, figured it out too late. He came alone one evening, unannounced, to the small apartment Ethan had used once and abandoned months earlier. He was desperate, cornered. Men like him always underestimated the cost of arrogance. Ethan met him there. No weapons were drawn, no threats spoken. The man tried to explain, tried to justify, tried to minimize the damage as collateral. He said Grace had been uncooperative. He said Ethan's father had known the risks. He said, "This is how the world works." Ethan listened. Then he handed the man a folder. Inside were documents tying him personally, not the company, to falsified reports, bribery, and attempted murder. Evidence that ensured no settlement, no corporate shield, no political favor could save him. "You should have killed me too," the man whispered. Ethan shook his head. That would have been mercy. The arrest came quietly 3 weeks later, then another, then another. Calderon Development Group collapsed publicly within the year, but not before it took lives with it. Careers ended, families fractured, reputations incinerated overnight. Grace's journalist contact finally published everything, backed by undeniable proof. The story spread nationwide. Congressional hearings followed. So did indictments. People called Ethan a hero. They were wrong. Heroes walk away intact. Fate always collects its due. The price came in subtler ways. Grace never returned to the woman she once was. Her body healed enough to move forward, but her spirit carried scars that no justice could erase. Some nights she still woke gasping, and Ethan still reached for her, even when she didn't know his name for a few terrifying seconds. Ruth never recovered her memory fully. Some days she remembered Ethan as a child. Other days she asked where his father was, and Ethan had to choose between truth and mercy, over and over again. And Ethan himself? He could never return to quiet life. Construction sites felt different now. Authority sounded hollow. He couldn't stand in crowds without mapping exits. He couldn't listen to laughter without wondering how quickly it could be taken away. The man who once believed avoiding trouble guaranteed safety was gone. In his place stood someone fate had shaped through loss. Years later, when everything had settled into a fragile calm, Ethan stood alone at his father's grave. The wind moved through the trees like a confession whispered too late. "I understand now," he said softly. Fate had never wanted him comfortable. It had wanted him awake. The betrayal, the accident, the silence, the inheritance of injustice, it wasn't random cruelty, it was alignment. Every step had carved him into the only person capable of ending what had begun decades before he ever knew the truth. He paid the price not with his life, but with the one he thought he was meant to live. And fate, finally satisfied, let him keep what mattered most. Grace was alive, the truth was free, and Ethan Walker, though forever changed, had become exactly what the world had tried so hard to destroy. Not a hero, not a villain, just a man who refused to disappear.